Leo?
Michael, I think it starts and stops with, do we want to have a national manufacturing policy or not? The other 19 members of the G20 have such a policy. It's very specific. China's is the most specific by far. But it would not tolerate a circumstance where only 8 or 9% of American workers are then in the sector. It would not tolerate a world where small and medium-sized enterprises can't get loans. It would not tolerate a world where China, on that plant that the congressman referred to, it gets its sites for free, it gets its construction loans for free, it gets a tax holiday, and it dumps effluent into the Yangtze and emissions into the air, and that's the competitor for the plant that the congressman is describing. It starts and stops with, can we as a nation survive much longer with only 8 or 9% of women and men making something? Because if you think you can, you can't. Then you have to go to, where would we most immediately see a manufacturing renaissance? And that is in that $3 trillion of decrepit infrastructure. If it had a buy domestic aspect to it, it would be, you would have the policy first, Michael, and then you'd have the kick in the pants. The opportunity would be in our own infrastructure until we got this thing balanced. Which
is your number one recommendation in the task force report. I wonder whether you would talk a little bit about that and some of the other recommendations. I mean, are these actually in order of importance or feasibility, or?
No, they're not. But I do think the group felt very, very strongly about two issues. One is the bank. I'm sorry, bank coupled with buy domestic and a more harsher perspective on China trade. Let me digress a minute, Tom, if I can, on the bank. The bank must be a bank. It must have an equity capitalization accompanied by a debt capitalization. Yet when you go to the White House and talk about the bank, they talk about a de minimis amount of money that would come out and dribble out in block grants. Yet we know from the senator's work and the congressman's, we know, and CalPERS, congressman is a superb example, we know from the wonderful treasurer of the state of California that CalPERS, the largest pension fund in the world, would love to have an investment opportunity in a national infrastructure bank to be the leverage for that bank. It's a superb idea. The members of the Senate and the House that have focused on this issue appreciate the opportunity, Michael, yet we can't get past a fellow named Tim Geithner who wants no banks except his banks. and the wonderful Congressman Leonard Boswell just walked in. I can't find for a small or medium-sized manufacturer in Iowa a $50 million loan today if my life depended on it. But I just watched J.P. Morgan give $20 billion loan commitment to AT&T to buy T-Mobile, which is a problematic deal. Yeah. But what the congressman is trying to do in Iowa and the senators trying to do in Iowa, it's been diminished by an insensitivity to small and medium-sized manufacturers and frankly, Michael, to the absence of a fundamental manufacturing and an industrial policy for this nation.
Please.
One of the things that this report recommends on page 33 is that we move to balance our trade in 5 years. Now, maybe the 5 years is, but we need to balance our trade. Let me just help you. The administration has set a goal of doubling exports. But if you look at what's happening, imports are increasing faster than exports. So when you have a negative net export figure, meaning your imports are less than your exports, that's a drag on your economy. And we have massive net export figures year after year. Warren Buffett, in a famous article in Fortune magazine in October 2003, advocated that the United States needs to adopt policies to balance its trade. Now, people always hear, you hear in the debate now, China owns so much of our treasuries. We're dependent on them. Where did China get the money to own so much of our treasuries? We gave it to them by running these massive trade deficits year after year. So here's the way the Chinese do it. When the dollars come into China, the Chinese government buys those dollars from the people, bring them in, and they give those people yuan. Then the Chinese government issues bonds to suck up those yuan so that they don't get inflation in their economy. The Chinese government ends up with the dollars. They don't want to just put them in a mattress, so they buy our treasuries. Therefore, they get income from the treasuries. They also get leverage over us. Now, is this a crazy thing for this country to be let going on? And the hole is getting deeper. As Tennessee Ernie Ford used to say, we're another day older and deeper in debt. We got to change the trends here. And this is very important, this recommendation, to move to balance our trade. When Kennedy said we're going to get to the moon in this decade, nobody knew how to get to the moon, but he set the goal and we figured it out. We can figure these things out if we set some goals for ourselves, and we ought to. Not just doubling exports, balancing trade.
Gerald?
Yeah, I wanted to expand a little bit on Leo's comments about infrastructure and the infrastructure bank investment, because I think this is really the linchpin between the micro goal of rebuilding our manufacturing sector and the macroeconomic goals relating to jobs, capital, and insufficient demand. And it's just not CalPERS that is looking. There is, paradoxically, as we're debating reducing and doing a deficit deal, which will actually cut the amount of fixed income debt available, there's a shortage of fixed income debt that is occurring because of the collapse of the mortgage market. One. Two, as baby boomers approach retirement, fixed income investments become much more important to them. And three, as emerging markets population enter their prime savings period, there's going to be an additional flood of capital. We actually need to generate attractive fixed income investments that a national infrastructure bank would occur in order to have a workable banking and financial system in the world. That's one thing. So you put together what infrastructure and the infrastructure bank does. It leverages and puts to work all this idle capital. It's just not 1 to 2 trillion. It's 3 to 4 trillion when you add in all the excess liquidity that is floating out in the global economy. You crowd in a like-minded amount of not just putting private capital work in the debt markets, but you put crowd in private investment into because of the multiplier effect that infrastructure investment has. Moreover, then you also facilitate not just directly the manufacturing sector, but more importantly, some other key sectors of the economy upon which America's future rests, and in particular, the energy and transportation systems. We have an enormous abundance. Representative Mendy talks about solar. Let me talk about natural gas. We have an enormous abundance of natural gas and shale oil located in all parts of the country. We don't have the infrastructure to move that or to put it into use. There'll be $1 trillion of investment, an enormous amount of jobs that are needed over the next 5 to 10 years to build out that infrastructure to make us to actually balance our energy picture. Yeah. We have an enormous potential if we rebuild the manufacturing base to move goods and services around the countries. One of the principal ways of doing that is our enormous inland waterways, not just the Mississippi, but the Great Lakes. We've allowed them to deteriorate so enormously that they're not as energy efficient. These are the most energy efficient ways of moving goods and services around the world. We need $5 to $10 billion of investment over the next 5 to 10 years to be able to move the goods and services in a much more efficient and attractive way, which makes it very attractive to manufacture things in the center of the country and actually move them around new population centers that are located in whether it's in the Great Lakes or Texas. So infrastructure investment, and a bank in particular, where you could leverage a small amount of public capital, as Leo has described, into a much larger, take $1 to $2 trillion off the sidelines, put it to work, both in the debt and equity markets, has an enormous appeal as the centerpiece of an economic recovery and jobs program.
Before we turn it over to the